Most Americans are not aware that there are millions of Kurdish people that live on the borders of Iraq, Syria, and Turkey and are assembled now in refugee camps as a result of the wars. Today on the Roundtable Perspective, Professor Wuerffel from Valparaiso University joins me in examining the conditions of life for those in refugee camps in a documentary that she made with students from Valparaiso University. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Liz Wuerffel, who is an Associate Professor of Art at Valparaiso University. Welcome, Dr. Wuerffel.
Thank you for having me.
You're also the co-director of the Welcome Project, the oral history collection of stories from Northwest Indiana, and you teach classes in media arts. We invited you here because of the documentary that you produced called Kawergosk, Home Made in Cloth?
Yeah, Kawergosk, home made of cloth.
Kawergosk, yes, okay. I thought maybe you could give us some background. I mean, the film was made almost 5 years ago now, although the conditions on the ground for Kurdish people in the Iraqi, Syrian, Turkish region remain the same. But maybe give us some background to how the film was made and what led you there.
Sure. So I teach in the art department at Valparaiso University, but also in our graduate digital media program. And one of the students that I had was Saddam Al-Zubaidi, who became co-director of the film with me. And he was a Fulbright student, come over to study at Valparaiso, and he was from Iraq, originally from Baghdad, but moved his family to the Kurdish region for more safety. And
Is he Kurdish?
He's actually not. He's Arab, yeah, Iraqi. But it was a safer area for him to be in. So he had moved to Erbil, which is one of the major cities in the Kurdish region of Iraq. And his wife and 2 children were there, and then he came to the US for graduate studies. So he actually was there in the fall of 2014. And then around, I think, April in the spring, 2013, in April in the spring of 2014, he came to me and said, Liz, do you want to do a documentary with me? Well, tell me more about it. And he said, well, I really wanted to stay and do an internship this summer, but my wife says I have to go back and help her take care of the kids. So I just found out that there is a new refugee camp that just opened in, I think it was August of that year.
Kawergosk.
Right next to Erbil.
Okay.
And so it was called Kawergosk. And there is a small town of Kawergosk that it's named after. So within just those 8 months of him having been at Valparaiso, this new refugee camp opened up. And so he thought, well, why not make a documentary about the camp, since it was essentially in his backyard. It was about 20 miles from where he lived. I initially assumed that I wouldn't, in that short term, because it was April and we were talking about going in June, that there would be no way I could actually get all my paperwork together, assuming that you would need a visa to get to Iraq. But it turns out if you go to the Kurdish region of Iraq, you just need your US passport. You fly into Turkey and fly over to Erbil.
Oh, Turkey doesn't mind that you're flying into the Kurdish region?
No, no. And so when I realized that, we could go.
And then set the time period too, because 2014 is the time when ISIS overtook Mosul, and a name people don't like to talk about, Soleimani.
Right.
Organized
a resistance.
Malicious fighters and probably saved Iraq and saved
a lot of the Kurds.
A lot of the Kurds and the Iraqi nation, actually. So, but that's 2014. And so you're there when this is happening? Or
I actually boarded the airplane the day that ISIS stormed Mosul. And so as I'm boarding Turkish Airlines is a really great airline. So you're walking down the corridor into the airplane, and they have newspapers set out so you can grab one to read during your flight. And the only one that was in English I picked up.
It says you're flying into ISIS territory.
Right on the front cover is this truck with a missile, and it says ISIS storms Mosul. And Erbil is just about 30 miles from Mosul. I thought, well, let's do this. So I get on the plane, get to Turkey, and then that next plane was very interesting because it was me and journalists. And that's who was on the plane heading to Erbil because of this breaking story.
And you were flying to Erbil?
Yep. Yep.
But you're not staying in Erbil, you're immediately going to the refugee camp?
No, actually we stayed in Erbil because we weren't allowed to stay in the refugee camp overnight.
Okay.
So we actually commuted back and forth each day. It was a very interesting time on the ground because as soon as ISIS stormed Mosul, they also hit an oil refinery and took over the oil refinery. And it shut down oil production for much of the Kurdish region and Iraq. And so we went from gas being super cheap, I think it was like 25 cents or 50 cents a gallon, to being incredibly hard to get within the 2 weeks that we were filming.
So the refugees in the refugee camp, were they Iraqi, were they Kurdish, who were the refugees?
So in the
And where were they
Kawergosk
from?
camp.
Were they from Mosul? I mean, were they coming that far? Or?
Actually, they were coming from Syria itself,
they're
near
coming
the
from
Turkish
Syria,
border,
okay.
but also all the way as far as Damascus. So a wide variety, but all Kurds. And I think they were, of course, going to the Kurdish region of Iraq because of that affinity with the
It's
Iraqi
an area,
Kurds.
I mean, I would assume most Americans don't know what Kurds are or where Kurdistan.
Yeah, they probably
if
think
that's
it's like
an entity.
Wisconsin cheese
Yeah,
or something,
yeah.
right? Yeah, no, these are beautiful
But
people.
Kurds live in a region that's where Syria meets Iraq and Turkey and Syria
Iran,
all
too.
meet, and Iran.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a kind of a region that Kurds have lived historically. So
Yeah.
these were all Kurdish refugees, but they were largely from Syria, not Iraq.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so the Syrian Kurds moved in across the border into Iraq because the Kurdish region of Iraq, because they knew they would find safety there.
ما في عيش بسوريا يعني ما نقدر نعيش بسوريا. سوريا كمان مقطوعة الكهرباء يعني مقطوعة باليوم بالكامل.
والله سمعنا ال 15 سنة عطولة هذا الشيء، ايمتى يستمر؟ بلكي نضل هون ونزوج اولادنا كمان هون، ما بقى نتحمل هون العيشة.
هلا بيتعذب شغل عامل عادي كتير صعب عليك، إذا بيجي على البيت مثلا المساء بيكون دغري بتطب وبتنام يعني من وجعه ومن تعبه، صعب كتير عليه هون.
سوري از مساعد مهندس كهرباء هي كم مشي منتو نزلها بريش نهار منقع بكنا عمري من 5 سنة نقع حموش.
It's not good or irregular floor and the tent is small in size. The water supply is very poor water supply. Like when she want to bring the water for her tent, she must go away from the tent just to bring a heavy amount of water to return back to her tent. Yeah.
When I saw the film, it was like, well, those could be Syrian refugees in Turkey, or they could be Salvadoran refugees in Honduras, or they could be Uyghur refugees leaving China. I mean, I'm not quite sure why, beyond the reason that there was somebody that knew the region. What was the intended audience for this?
So I think that speaks to maybe the bigger global issue of refugee crises,
Yes.
And the fact that this film could be almost anywhere. I mean, it's obviously in a desert, it's hot when we filmed, but besides that, there are so many refugee crises that it could be any number of them. And I think that speaks to the universality of the situation, but then there are also very specific things about it being Kurdish, so it doesn't really cover the experience of other Syrian refugees who don't see themselves as Kurds or aren't Kurds. And Lebanon, of course, and other areas have actually been hit much harder with Syrian refugees fleeing to their countries.
Yeah, I understand Turkey has over 3 million refugees
Right.
from Syria that are now in Turkey.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, it's a global condition, but not all refugee situations have the same kind of cause and effect. So This one in particular is dealing with Kurds, who most Americans wouldn't know. So, was the intent of the film to address the question of refugees in general, or was the intent of the film to bring the attention of whatever citizens may view it of the plight of the Kurdish refugees?
I think it was twofold. I don't know if we were successful at doing that, but we were, of course, hoping to speak to more broadly situation, plight of refugees. But because it's so specific in that it's being filmed in the Kurdish region,
Yes.
and it's about Kurds, you
And
hear
at the
a
time
lot.
it's being filmed. That's the
Yeah,
other thing.
right.
Yes.
So that, especially in the introduction, you hear some of the history of the Syrian Kurds and how they feel like they aren't exactly Syrian either. And so they're left out of certain things or can't move around as easily. So it is particular, but also hopefully universal.
So when I saw the film, it was obvious to me that you or the co-producer or directors were artists, because it was a very beautifully done film. But how did you decide to portray the refugees? I mean, was there a discussion, a thought, or was it you just filmed and then came back home? But at some point there had to be some discussion about how do we want to portray the refugees, or even the particular refugees that appear in the film. Was there a decision made about that, or?
So some of it was made on the ground when we got there, and that's in part because we had certain expectations. Saddam in particular thought that we would end up being able to interview more men than women, given the cultural, I think.
But you interviewed many, women.
It was
Yeah.
women who were most able to be open and wanted to talk to us. And so that surprised us, but actually after or while doing it, it started to make sense that the men actually had the most to lose. Well, first off, they were rarely in the camp during the day because they were out trying to get work, if they were there at all. So this war divides families, it separates families. So some refugees had a grandmother or some of the family in different refugee camps. And so it really
Kurdish refugee
splits.
camps
That's right.
always, yeah.
And there are now, I think, 9 refugee camps in the Kurdish region, but at the time there were 4 or 5. And so you would have some families that were fragmented by the war, some that the men who had died in the war. And then there was definitely a sense that if you saw during the credits, there's the people, we give them first names, but then there are a number of people who are anonymous. And that's because they are worried about retaliation from the Syrian government.
It's a beautiful documentary. I mean, I keep coming back to that, the way it was filmed.
Yeah.
And the interviews and the framing, but it's also distressing because it's, as you said, refugee situation is a global, contemporary, ongoing problem. So was this intended to be part of a larger educational effort to make some connections with Kurdish refugees, or in solidarity with Kurdish refugees like often happens with others, or was this primarily just an educational standalone documentary?
Yeah, I think we saw it as a standalone. It was interesting because we didn't know exactly, this is true in documentary generally, especially when you're on the go. You're not sure what you're going to get until you're back. But that was doubly so because some of the refugees, some of the people we interviewed spoke Arabic, others spoke Kurdish, and then within Kurdish there are a number of dialects. And a couple of them spoke English, but none of us knew all 3 languages. So I knew English and Russian, which didn't help.
Really? There weren't Russians everywhere. No. I thought they were responsible for everything. And Saddam spoke Kurdish?
Yeah, so Saddam spoke Arabic, but not much Kurdish.
Okay.
And then we had another great guy who was on the team, Sarhang Sherweni, and he was Kurdish from Erbil.
Was he from Valparaiso?
Yeah, he also, so he heard about us doing this and immediately joined our team.
So you had somebody that could speak Kurdish, somebody that could
That's
speak
right.
Arabic, and somebody that spoke English to the English speakers.
And English was the only common language for the 3 of us. So we didn't know what was on all of the interviews until we trusted each other.
Yeah.
And then when we got back in the editing room, we went through and translated line by line everything. And that's when we understood the story.
It kind of surprises me that at the time, 2014, when ISIS is moving and the US and Russia are at odds, and Mosul looks like it's going to fall, that you, with a couple college students from the middle of Indiana, are allowed to go to a refugee camp. What was the response? I mean, like when you show up at the camp, what was how were you received by the authorities, the UN or others? How were you received by the residents of the camp? I mean, how did they view you?
Yeah. So, I mean, until maybe recently, the Kurdish people very much love Americans. And we've had a strong relationship in the past decade.
They presume that the U.S. would come to their defense at some point.
That's right. And so in Erbil, certainly the Kurdish people, when they knew I was American, wanted to invite me to tea, lots of good interactions. In the refugee camp, so that even though it's a UN camp, the security system is Kurdish security. And so you go through a number of different security points to get into the camp. And Sarhang was our help there because his cousin actually was working in the camp. And so he was able to get us a pass into the camp. But even 1 week in, the administration of the camp changed. So we had to go back through the process of getting permission.
So every day to go into the camp to do the interviews?
Yep, we had to show our paperwork. And so Saddam, being an Arab from Baghdad and a name Saddam. not a name that Kurds particularly appreciate.
Right.
So we would also have to go through a security checkpoint to get back into the city. And so as we would drive back into the city, Saddam and I were the primary filmmakers, and Sarhang wasn't always with us. We would drive back in, and he had his VU, his Valparaiso University ID. He, of course, had his own paperwork and passport, and I had my passport. And we would get up to the security, and he would roll down his window, and he would hand them my passport and not his. And he would never say his name. He would say, "I'm a student at Valparaiso University. This is my professor.
Yeah.
We're filming a documentary in the refugee camp. We're heading back into town." And if they asked to see his paperwork, he would only ever show them his student ID.
So the video is very powerful. It's very arresting, and the conditions of the camp finds it. But it's, when I viewed it with some friends, one of them commented that it almost romanticizes the people.
Oh, because of the aesthetic of the
The
film.
aesthetic of the film and the articulate. Many of the women were very articulate, and the way the film was made. So, I mean, how do we like not get into, titillation by refugee almost? We're used to spectacle, and how do we get away from that? Or did you consider that when you were making the film and pulled back from too much of the artistic, or?
I don't know. I think for us, what we wanted to do is have honest and I think very personal conversations with the people who are willing to talk with us. And we were working with DSLR cameras with like a 50 millimeter lens, so you're going to get some of that aesthetic just by nature of the lenses you have.
That makes for a closer, more intimate, not the camp as a whole, so it becomes just this.
And the focus drops off.
Yeah.
But a lot of that is around, I think, respecting the person for who they are, and they're beautiful people. So you would want to also show them in that light. I think the same could be said about like a run and gun. We're in the middle of the fight, bombs are dropping everywhere. Aren't you also causing the same kind of glorification of war or something like that? So I'm not sure.
Well, sometimes they call that violence porn, so that it doesn't have significance.
Right.
It's just the very spectacle. So, and I'm not suggesting that here, but I'm suggesting that we're almost inundated with the plight of refugees, and not documentaries per se, but news accounts. And sometimes there will be journalists on the ground that will interview somebody, and you hear their story, and it's like for if you're not intimately involved, well, how do you evaluate this in terms of what I might do or how I might respond to this? Because it's tragic, it's unsettling, it's inhumane, and here's a human person in front of us, and I don't know if it desensitizes or it inundates with so much tragedy that it's hard to process.
I think one of the things we were striving for, which I've mostly heard from people who've seen the film, is that we often think of refugees as this big number, so 3 million, 5 million, however many it is.
And that's what the big lens would do too, right?
Yeah,
if you have a shot of the whole camp.
And I think that in part makes it seem like it's overwhelming and there's nothing we can do. But to have Sabat, who was the mother of the child who was burned, actually talking to us about her day-to-day life, makes you realize that actually this is a normal person, and they're in this terrible situation, but they're also making a home out of it and doing what they can.
They're cooking dinner, they're clothing their children.
They're wanting to be a chef when they grow up.
Yes.
So I think it's moments like that that actually connect our humanity to each other across these other huge lines that often divide us. Not just the distance, but also the culture, the language, the expectations we have of each other. So I would hope that we were working against some of that, even if the film also looks beautiful.
Well, I don't know. You've done the circuit of film festivals and stuff. I would hope that when you introduce it, you make the point that you just made, that we're trying to recover the humanity of people that seem to be faceless and caught up in a situation that doesn't seem to have a solution. So I don't know if you...
Yeah, I should write that down.
Well, when you go to the film festivals, do the films just get shown, or is there like a question and answer period where people...
Some of them do that, and that's helpful, especially for a film like ours where you don't have the context going into it. And that was partly intentional on our part because we ended up in the Kurdish refugee camp, and so that was the story we ended up telling instead of the bigger Syrian war story, which would have needed 2 hours or 14. I don't know, how long is the Ken Burns Vietnam War? So,
well, when you get sucked into that, there's so many polemics and so many positions. Whatever perspective you have takes a long time just to try to explain that on the morass. But my question was partly, I don't believe it's so complex that we can't make sense of it. I don't believe that any refugee situation or the conditions are kind of natural or normal like an earthquake, but there's actually causal forces and political forces, and somebody has to make the ammunition and sell the ammunition and provide the gasoline for the trucks that are going one way or the other.
Or cut up the countries after World War I.
Yes, after World War. The whole idea that there is no Kurdistan is not, I mean, that's just almost incomprehensible in a world where there's 190 nations in the UN, and some lots smaller than Kurdistan. But this one cannot be for a variety of reasons, which I wouldn't expect you to address this in the film. Maybe one last thing. Some of the best moments for me were those moments that didn't have dialogue, and I wonder if that was a conscious effort or if that was just the outcome of the lens or the timing that you had. I remember there was one where a young girl was carrying a water jug to fill it up, and that seemed to me to capture the whole context or the plight of the situation more than some long explanation of how we're surviving. You're seeing the young girl with her jug going to get the water, which is...
Understanding that is a daily task.
Yep. I mean, and it was beautifully filmed, but I don't know if did you intersperse some of those things to cut up the dialogue, to make the dialogue more meaningful, or was it...
I think so, and to build out the environment of the camp, because if you're just in the tent the whole time interviewing someone, you don't actually get to see what it looks like or feels like across the full refugee camp. We have talked about doing a short documentary where it's just those fragments, something much more experimental. We haven't gotten to do it, but a 5-minute where it would just be a series of those images.
I think it might be valuable too to talk about how you made the decisions, some of the technical choices, like you said, with how big the millimeter was of the film and how you were framing things. So you're making a connection between the technical work and the meaning that you were trying to construct or convey, which the two are related. I could see that would be a useful, at least for your documentary film students. So, is there something else planned coming up? Is Saddam and Zeng back in?
Saddam's down in Bloomington now, working there at a TV station with his family, and Sarhang is in Canada. So I think they're on their own journeys right now, but we would love to get the team back together and do something in the future. We'll see if it happens.
Let's repeat the name of the documentary.
Kawergosk home made of cloth.
And that's available if people were to Google
Yeah.
it, they could find a
That's
link
right.
to be able to see it.
It's online on Vimeo.
Oh, it's on Vimeo, excellent. Film made by videographers at Valparaiso University. Thank you, Dr. Wuerffel. That's all the time we have on our program today, and I want to thank Dr. Wuerffel again for joining me on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz, your host. See you next time.